So hello and welcome to episode 1 of this History of Logic series. Just before we get into today's topic, which is Aristotle's logic, I'm going to talk about why I'm doing this series. So I have studied logic in a few different subject areas now, so philosophy, mathematics, and software engineering and computer science. And I've found that logic can be covered from different angles in each of these that can seem like it has very little overlap. Words can be used in idiosyncratic, different and difficult ways, and it can be difficult to develop a full understanding of what's going on. So I decided that what I wanted to do is study all through the history of logic to get a firmer grasp of the kind of terms and concepts being involved, where they come from and what they mean. And I thought another good way for me to teach myself this would be to make some slides, sort of gathering together my notes and things and present them to people to try and explain and articulate the ideas. So that's what I'm hoping to do in this series. And this being episode 1, we're going to focus on Aristotle's logic, who is the sort of he's known as the philosopher in history, and he's the first person, at least as far as I'm aware. Maybe there are some non-Western people who do look at logic in other traditions, but as far as I'm aware, he's the first person to look at logic in and of itself and study it in terms of forms. So Aristotle says a deduction or syllogism is an argument in which things being supposed, something else different from the things being supposed follows of necessity because of their being so. So that might sound like a bit of a mouthful, so let's break that down a little bit. So a deduction or a syllogism, that's just an argument with premises and a conclusion. Certain things being supposed, which would be our premises, something else different, that would be the conclusion, from the things being supposed, follows of necessity because of their being so. So this following of necessity means that combining the premises together makes whatever this conclusion is true. It guarantees that it's going to be true. It follows of necessity. It can't be false because of their being so. So just some points on Aristotle, that he's the first to consider the form of an argument abstract from and independent of its content. So there's lots of people in this period who are arguing about various topics, whether everything in reality is constantly changing, whether there's one fundamental substance, whether everything is full of gods and made of water, but not very many people focusing on argument forms, what it is that makes an argument truth-preserving, how premises lead to a conclusion. So Aristotle's the first person to do this. And Kant, who's a philosopher living 1784 to 1804, thought that Aristotle, and Aristotle was around in the 4th century BC, had discovered everything there was to know about logic. So you can see the kind of dominance of his thought for such a long period of time, that it's not really until the late 19th/early 20th century that Aristotle is overturned, first by people like George Boole. You might have heard of Boolean algebra and logic, and then by Frege and Russell in their various different conceptions of logic. And hopefully we'll come on to all this stuff in later episodes, but you can see the dominance and importance of Aristotle's ideas for this massive 2,000-year period of time. So Aristotle's logical works are contained in a collection of his writings, which is referred to as the Organon, the Organon meaning instruments. Now, this isn't a book that Aristotle wrote that's called the Organon, but it's the name given to this collection of his works by people who are teaching philosophy later on. So people who are in the peripatetic tradition, which is those following on from Aristotle, they believe that logic isn't, rather than being like a part of philosophy itself, it's this tool that students should learn in order to facilitate their learning of logic and their learning of philosophy and their engagement with philosophy. So they categorize these books together into the Organon and say, hey, if you're wanting to learn philosophy, here's where you begin with these works in the Organon. Now, there's different schools of philosophy who approach this differently. For example, those following in the Stoic tradition. And so it's kind of part of this contentious ancient/medieval discussion about where logic fits into philosophy. But these are classically the works that are considered containing Aristotle's logical works, even though other books, for example, Aristotle's Metaphysics, contain things that we would consider to be logic. So in these slides, in this presentation, the main contents that I'm going to be focusing on are in the following books. So the categories on interpretation, which you might see me as having written as De Interpretatione, and prior analytics as well. So I'm just going to expound on what's in them. So the categories is about ways of predicating things. So to predicate in Greek means to blame/accuse. And so in the categories, there's talk about essential and accidental features of things. An essential feature of something would be the features that something has in virtue of being that thing. So, for example, a bicycle might have the essential features of having two wheels. If it didn't have two wheels, it would cease to be a bicycle. If it had three wheels, it would be a tricycle. So that would be an essential feature. Whereas the accidental features of something are the things that can change, and it would still be the same thing. So a bicycle can be red or blue. It can have a missing pedal. It can be driven by a chain or a belt, though I don't really know that anyone makes bicycles that are driven by belts. But the point is that those are accidental features rather than essential ones. And this is an important distinction in Aristotle's kind of theory of categories here. He also talks about symbols and sounds versus meanings, so the written symbol, the sound of a word, versus the meaning of it in the intellect. He talks about equivocal use of words versus univocal use. So equivocal would be when we use a word in a different sense or with a different meaning. So I might say, I'll meet you at the bank. So you go to HSBC or NatWest and you're waiting by the ATM machine. And I go down to my local park and I'm standing by the riverbank, and we're both wondering where each other is. And it's because I've equivocally used the word bank there. It's the same sound, but it's used in a different sense. A univocal use would be where we're using it in the same sense. So if we were using it univocally, we would have both met either outside the ATM machine or down by the riverbank. The categories has a bit of an origin in Plato's Academy. So Aristotle is Plato's greatest student, and Aristotle would have been taught in the Academy, and in the Academy there's this obsession with classifying things. So there's this famous story about Diogenes the Cynic, and Plato's definition of a human was a featherless biped. So Diogenes the Cynic turns up one day with a plucked chicken and says, "Behold Plato's man," which is a bit of a myth/joke in ancient philosophy. And there are 10 categories or types of predication which Aristotle comes up with in the categories, and these are substance, quality, quantity, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and being acted upon. So then the second of these books, which I'm kind of drawing on here, is on interpretation. So this pertains to philosophy of language, really. So whether words have significance by nature or convention. So for words to have significance by nature would mean there's something about the cup which makes me use the word cup to describe it, whereas it being convention would mean cup is just a noise that I make which stands for a cup. So Aristotle thinks that we name things by convention, and that what names signify is a thought in my soul. So written words stand for the spoken, so the symbols that you can see now if you're looking at these slides, they just stand for the spoken words that I'm reading out. Spoken words stand for the thought, and the thought stands for the thing in the world. So the thought is about a cup, for example. So this sort of accounts for, say, different languages. So I can say snow is white, or is it Schnee or Schnee ist weiß, or la neige is blanche in French. My terrible foreign language skills coming through. The point is that even though the noises that I make there are different, they can represent the same meaning. They're about the same things, namely snow being white. On interpretation, he also talks about the study of sentences which assert or deny something. So we can assert or deny things universally. So, for example, to say all X is Y, all X's are Y is a universal affirmation. To say no X is Y is a universal privation. To say a particular X is Y, some X is Y, is a particular predication, and then a particular privation would be to say some X is not Y. And on interpretation also contains the C battle argument, which we'll talk about a little bit later going through these slides. So then the third book of the ones that we're looking at contains prior analytics. So this is where sentences are put into arguments. So the conjunction of sentences forms these arguments or syllogisms. And syllogisms for Aristotle have two premises and a conclusion. And then there's one term which connects both premises. So that is the middle term which connects them. And the prior analytics is also where Aristotle is the first person in history to use variables to allow for the construction and study of these argument forms independently of the thing that's being argued for. And we'll talk about this a little bit later as we try to develop a bit of an intuition for what it is that makes these premises truth-preserving, how they get to the conclusion. So first, before we get into logic, we're going to have to talk about what kind of sentences, what kind of combinations of words can be truth apt. So what kind of things, truth aptness meaning can be true or false. What can I say that can be true or false? Because there's, if I say, that's just a noise, right? That isn't true or false. So we're going to talk about names and verbs. And then Plato in Sophist says this of names and verbs. I'm about to sneeze, so... Nope, sneeze is gone. So the signs we use in speech to signify being are surely of two kinds. One kind called names, onoma. The other verbs, rhema. By verb, we mean an expression which is applied to actions. And by name, the spoken sign applied to what performs these actions. Now, a statement never consists solely of names spoken in succession, nor yet verbs apart from names. Now, if that seems a bit wordy, if you'll pardon the pun, basically what's being said there is that we don't just say names. So Aristotle's going to use the example of man or ox, or, cup, pen, table, chair. Like, that isn't a meaningful sentence that's capable of being true or false. And similarly, we don't just say a bunch of verbs together, like run, swing, jump. Like, that doesn't really mean anything. You have to be saying verbs of a name in order to be saying something meaningful. And Aristotle explicates this a little bit in his Categories, where he says, of things that are said, some involve combination, while others are said without combination. So examples of those involving combination are man runs, man wins. And of those without combination, man, ox, run, wins. So taken on their own, man, ox, or run, wins doesn't mean anything that could be true or false. I mean, it means something, like man is about man, but it isn't just true or false. Whereas if we say man runs, that's true just in case a man is running. So we have to have this kind of combination of words in order to be saying something, to affirm something. So noun, verb, sentences are truth apt. And a name, onoma, is a spoken sound significant by convention, without time, none of whose parts is significant in separation. So significant here meaning truth apt. A verb, rhema, is what additionally signifies time, no part of it being significant separately, and it is a sign of things said of something else. So runs is said of something else. There's not runs in and of itself, like runs nature or something. Like, there's a particular man runs, or all men run, or all ostriches run, but there's not runs. So what is the subject of logic then, to direct it a bit more towards the topic of these slides? So Aristotle said in our quote earlier, certain things being supposed leading to something else following of necessity. So what are the things being supposed? All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is immortal. Those things being supposed are the premises or protasis to sort of test my Greek. So those are the two premises there. All men are mortals, Socrates is a man. What results of necessity is our conclusion, or sumparasma in Greek. So Socrates is a mortal, in this case, is the conclusion that results of necessity. We talked about the middle term. The middle term is this connecting term between the premises. It sort of joins up, in our conclusion, we've got Socrates is mortal, and men is the thing that joins those two together. This is called a meson in Greek. And then the extreme are the terms that aren't the middle premise. So in this case, Socrates and mortal. So there's things that are mortal, that would be like a category. And there's a particular thing called Socrates. And these are extremes, not the middle term. There's a major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion. So in our conclusion, we're saying Socrates is mortal. So our major premise is the premise that contains that major term. Then our minor term is the term which is the subject of the conclusion. So in this case, the conclusion Socrates is mortal. So the premise that contains Socrates is a man, is our minor premise. It's also worth noting this term predicate. A predicate is a class of things. It's in modern language, I suppose we'd say like a class of objects or something like that. But to predicate something is a collection of things which have a particular property, right? That's a predicate. This other word that you might come across is copula. Copula is just the word that's being used to link the subject to the predicate, and that is generally going to be are or is. So every S is P, some S is P, all S are P, something like that. So then to talk about affirmation and denial. So what is this affirmation? Affirmation provides us with a way of talking about the world. So I can affirm some sentence about the world. The books are on the shelf. And then we can talk about whether that is true or false. And then for anything that's being affirmed, Aristotle says it must be possible to deny whatever anyone has affirmed and to affirm whatever anyone has denied. So every affirmation then has an opposite denial sentence or proposition. When two students affirm and deny the same thing of the same thing, maybe that's poorly formed grammar there, they're said to be in contradiction. So if I'm saying all swans are white, and you were saying to me that some swan is not white, then that means that we're in contradiction there. They can't both be true in the same sense at the same time. So bearing in mind that Aristotle has said for any proposition, its affirmation or its denial has to be true, we have this thing called the sea battle argument, which comes up, which is when metaphysics becomes of concern based off of our kind of logical theory. So for any pair of contradictory statements, one will be true and the other false. So if you consider a tensed statement, one that's about the future, for example, tomorrow there will be a sea battle and tomorrow there will not be a sea battle. So these are contradictories about the future. Now, one of them is going to be true and the other false. So say if tomorrow there will be a sea battle is true, does this mean that the future is fixed or that it happens of necessity? And this is a question that sort of, it's not exactly resolved in modern metaphysics today, but there's a quote from Nietzsche here about necessity, which I kind of like. Those iron hands of necessity which shake the dice box of chance play their game for an infinite length of time. So the idea of necessity is that everything that happens had to happen. It couldn't have been otherwise. Now, Aristotle has a solution to this problem, and his sort of get out is to say that statements about the future are neither true nor false. Now, we're not going to get too far into this sea battle argument, talk about like branching theories of time, contingency versus necessity, what those things are, but I think that that's an interesting thing that kind of follows from this logic here. So to talk about universal and particular affirmation and denial, we say that B belongs to A when A is B. So some predication B belongs to A in that case. And prior analytics 24a17, which is how we refer to particular chapters and paragraphs in Aristotle's works there, distinguishes between universal and particular statements. So universal statements are of the form, all A's are B, every A is B, or no A is B. So that universal is where we're classifying, we're categorizing an entire class there. Whereas particular is about an individual member of a class. So some A's are B, some A is B, some A is not B. And this is what makes Aristotle's logic categorical, because it's about categories and members of categories. Whereas in more modern logic, you'll probably come to it through some kind of sentential language or about propositions, where we'll be saying, if A, then B, A and B, sentences like that, A or B, rather than this kind of predication of categories and things. So it's a little bit different. Also to note about possibility and necessity. So if our premises are about necessary truths, so all giraffes have long necks. I'm not saying that is a necessary truth, but Aristotle is concerned with doing his logic in order to figure out necessary truths about the sciences. So this is his epistemology in his posterior analytics. And so there's this concern about if something is necessarily true, then is it always true? Well, yes, because a necessary truth could not have been otherwise. So if 2 + 2 = 4 is a necessary truth, there's no time at which 2 + 2 isn't going to equal 4. Whereas, what about something that is always true? So throughout time, it's always true, but does that mean it's necessarily true? Now, in modern logic, or modern metaphysics, to speak more precisely, we'd probably reject that. Whereas Aristotle says yes, and the posterior analytics, where Aristotle discusses his epistemology, discusses how our knowledge can only concern these necessary truths, and these are truths which are always true. So there's something called the square of opposition in Aristotle's logic, and this is going to act as a model for the kinds of propositions that Aristotle thinks exist, how they link together, how they guarantee validity. And the square of opposition is introduced in On Interpretation in this little paragraph here. So I'm just going to read that out first, and then we'll break it down and see what it's saying. I call an affirmation and a negation contradictory opposites when what one signifies universally, the other signifies not universally. For example, every man is white. Not every man is white. No man is white. Some man is white. But I call the universal affirmation and the universal negation contrary opposites. For example, every man is just. No man is just. So these cannot be true together, but their opposites may both be true with respect to the same thing. For example, not every man is white. Some man is white. Now, don't worry if that seems like a little bit of a mouthful at first, if you've struggled modelling that out in your mind. I'm going to break down this paragraph, and then we're going to kind of draw it out on this thing called the square of opposition, so you'll hopefully be able to see and get your head around what's being said here. So let's break down this first part. An affirmation and a negation are contradictory opposites when what one signifies universally, the other signifies not universally. So when you hear the statement, every man is white, you might think that it's contradictory, is no man is white, but that's not what Aristotle is saying here. Aristotle is saying that the contradictory is not every man is white, which is the same statement as some man is not white. Or, for example, no man is white, which would be a universal negative. The opposite isn't all men are white, but the opposite, the contradictory of that, is that some man is white. So those are contradictories. A contradictory would be a universal categorization of a thing, and then something not fitting that universal characterization. And then Aristotle says that initial supposition that we might have had about a universal affirmation, so every man is white, and we might have thought that the contradiction is that no man is white, but this is what Aristotle calls contrary opposites. So every man is just, no man is just. So these both cannot be true together. It can't be the case that every man is just and no man is just. But I suppose the difference is that it doesn't follow from knowing that not every man is just. It doesn't follow that no man is just. So it might just be the case that some men are just, some men are not just. So these are our contraries. So just to draw out what those words mean a little bit more. So contradictories, what one signifies universally, the other signifies not universally. So for the statement, every man is white, what's going to be our contradictory? Is it going to be that no man is white or some man is not white? You can think about that now. And then the answer is that it's some man is not white. Because for the sentence, every man is white to be true, every person that's in the class man would have to also be in the class white. Whereas if some man, if just one thing is a man and is not white, some man is not white, that contradicts the original statement completely. So then how about contrary opposites? So Aristotle says, I call the universal affirmation and the universal negation contrary opposites. So all birds fly. What is its contrary? Is it that no birds fly, or is it some bird does not fly? And you can think about that for a second. And the contrary is no birds fly, because this is the universal affirmation and the universal negation. They're contraries. They can't both be true at the same time, rather than some bird does not fly, which would be the contradictory. So here we have a medieval Latin kind of drawing of the square of opposition, and here's hopefully a more modern drawing which is going to be useful for you. And where this is kind of contained and mapped out is in chapter 6 and 7 of On Interpretation. So you can see that contradictories which go across the diagonal of the square of opposition, they contradict each other. Whereas the contraries, which are at the top, they can't both be true at the same time. Whereas subcontraries, which are the ones at the bottom, they can't both be false, but they could actually both be true. So I'll go over this slowly to hopefully make sense of it. Something I also want to say, though, is you see these letters A, E, I, and O. Well, what the hell do they mean? A lot of people learn this square of opposition and they never get a sense for what these A, E, I, and O are. I certainly didn't the first time that I read an Introduction to Logic book and it talked about Aristotle's logic. So the A and the I to do with affirmation, and this comes from when Aristotle's logic was being taught in medieval times. In medieval times, people, the language of the universities, the language of the Roman Catholic Church was Latin, and affirmo in Latin means I affirm. And the A and the I are the first vowels in that word. So you can see in affirmo we have A and the I. And when we look across at the square of opposition, we see that the positive affirmation sentences, so every S is P, some S is P, are A and I. Whereas the privation, the denial, are the word are E and O, which are the first vowels in nego, which is Latin for I deny. So when we're affirming, affirmo, AI. When we're denying, nego, I deny, it's E and O. So this is a helpful kind of mnemonic device, I suppose, for remembering what the letters stand for. And the reason that this is useful is that we're going to see our propositions written out as subject and predicate with an A, an I, an E, and an O in between the subject and predicate in order to figure out what kind of statement that it is later on. But don't worry about that too much for now. You'll hopefully see it in a clearer light in one of the future slides. So we have our contradictories. Every S is P. All swans are white. And then we have the contradictory of it. Some swan is not white. So just in case some swan is not white, that contradicts that every swan is white. Or contraries. So from every S is P. This is another interesting thing. We're going to talk about existential import for Aristotle. So if we're going to predicate an entire class, a universal, saying that every S is P, then it means that at least one member of the class actually exists. So that's why it follows that some S is not P. In a more modern logical system, if we could actually, it wouldn't follow from every S is P that some S is not P, that there is some existing S that's not P. So from it wouldn't. Well, it would be contradicted still. Sorry, it wouldn't follow that some exists, and this is what's called the problem of existential import, which I've got a slide for a little bit later on. But in Aristotle's logic, because these predications are to do with things that exist, things in the sciences, we can only actually predicate for classes which have existing things. So our contraries then are what cannot both be true at the same time. So every S is P and no S is P, contrary, cannot both be true at the same time. Whereas our sub-contraries, they can both be true at the same time, but they can't both be false at the same time. Okay, so let's move on from there. If you're still a bit confused, then hopefully these Venn diagram representations will help you to understand what's going on here. So this is the same layout, it's just a little bit of a different representation here. So when we say that all S are P, we've got two circles here. One circle represents things that are S. The other circle represents things that are P. So this is the class of things that are S, the class of things that are P. And it's in this Venn diagram representation of all the possible combinations of them. So on the far left, the one that's black there, would be things that are S and not P. The middle, the overlap section, is things that are S and P. And this right-hand section is things that are just P and not S. So when we say that all S are P, we rule out this section that's been blackened out here because there's nothing that is S and not P. That is to say that everything that is S is P. Everything that is S occurs in this space here that is P. However, there could still be things that are P that are not S, so that's why that isn't blacked out. When we universally deny, we do the exact opposite. So we say that there is nothing in this space that is both S and P. So everything that is S is independent from P. Now, when we look at the particular affirmation, then we can see that all we're saying here is that this space isn't completely empty. So that's why there's a little cross in that space. It just means that there's at least one thing, there's something that's in that space that is both S and P. And when we say that some S are not P, similarly, we're not saying anything. We can't say anything about whether there's anything in S and P, whether there's anything in just P. All we're saying is that there are some things that are S and they're not P. So we're saying that something belongs in this space. It's not completely empty. So some notation then to do with the square of opposition. So that universal affirmative, if we say B belongs to every A, or all A are B, that is going to be this notation. So B, A for affirmo, B, A. When we have a universal privative, that would be to say that B belongs to no A, or no A is B, every A is not B, something like that. That's going to be B, E, A, the little e there being nego, the first E in nego. Our I proposition, particular affirmative, B belongs to some A, which is, again, remember, affirmo, the I in the second half of that word. B belongs to some A is going to be BIA. And our particular privative, which is to say B does not belong to some A, or there's some A that is not B, there's some swan that is not white, is going to be O, that O in nego, BOA. So just to come back to the existential import thing then, existential import would be moving from every unicorn has a horn on its forehead. I mean, that just seems like what unicorn means. Going from that sentence to there's some unicorn that has a horn on its forehead. And in that second sentence where we say there's some unicorn that has a horn on its forehead, we're making a statement about existence. We're saying that there's some unicorn that exists that has a horn on its forehead. Now, something seems off about that. So a proposition has existential import if it implies that some class is not empty. Every S is P can be true only if the class S is not empty. This follows from Aristotelian scientific theory. So as we learn a bit more about Aristotle, I'll probably make a series of slides on this in future. We'll find out that his logic is a part of his general project to come up with a scientific theory about the way that the world is and to classify things that actually exist. So within Aristotle's theory, this means that if S is empty, then you can't have a true statement, every S is P. So a statement like every unicorn has a horn would have to be false if it's an empty class. But if it's true, it means that there is some existing member. It has to be a non-empty class. And it's not really until George Boole that this real distinction is kind of... I shouldn't use the term real distinction because that means something else in philosophy. But this distinction between a system of logic that has existential import is really made between particular and universal predication of things. So in Boole's system, you can actually say it's true that every unicorn has a horn on its forehead, but that doesn't imply that some unicorn exists. Okay, so how do these categorical proofs work? Let's build a bit of an intuition. What is it about certain premises being a certain way that means that the conclusion is also true? What's the relationship that's going on here? And we're going to use these sort of Venn-type diagrams in order to try and understand what it is that we're saying. So firstly, a note about the names of these argument forms. There's various forms of argument, various combinations of premises and of the types of premises and conclusion, and they've been given different names. This one is called Barbara. The reason it's called Barbara is because A. So that means, if you remember from our AEIO, A for affirmo, universal affirmation, it means that our first premise is an A, so a universal affirmation. Our second premise similarly is an A universal affirmation, and our conclusion is an a universal affirmation. So this is the form: all M are P, all S are M, thus all S are P. Okay, so why does it work? Well, let's look at that first premise. So that first premise, all M are P. M is represented here by the red circle, and P is represented by the blue circle. So we have this class of things, P, which is blue. And to say that all M are P means that everything that is M, everything in the red circle, is also P, is in that blue circle. Now, there might be things independently that are P but not M. That's kind of irrelevant to us. The point is that everything that is M is going to be P. It has to be. It's inside that set, so to speak. It's inside that circle. Right, so what does the second premise say? It says that all S are M. So everything that is S, which is represented by this green circle, is M, in that it's inside the class of things that are M. Now we can see rather intuitively, right, that it just follows that then everything that is S is also inside the blue circle. That's just where it is. I mean, that's a spatial representation, but that's, I suppose, how we think about the category of propositions. So every proposition that's going to be an S thing is also inside the P thing there. We're going to go through a few more of these to help build up this intuition so you can see what's going on with particulars and negation and stuff like that. So here is a second argument form. This one is called celerant. And you can see the vowels in the word celerant. So we've got E, A, E. E being universal negation, nego. A being universal affirmation, affirmo. And E, the conclusion, being universal negation, again. So what does our first premise have to say? So that is our E, our nego premise. No M is P. So we have these two classes, these two categories, M and P. M being the red circle and P being the blue circle. And when we say no M is P, we show that these two classes are mutually exclusive. That means there's nothing that's M that is P, there's nothing that's P that is M. They're completely separate from one another. What does our second premise say? All S are M. So S is this green circle, and S, our green circle, all of those are inside M. All things that are S are M. So then it follows that no S is P. Because if everything that is M is not going to be P, and everything that is S is going to be M, then it also has this property of not being able to be P in the blue circle. Okay, so let's move on to another one to see if we can build this intuition a little bit more. So this one is called Darii, and you can see here again AII. So we've got universal affirmation, and then we've got particular affirmation leading to a particular affirmation conclusion. So this one's going to be a bit different again. So our first premise, A, all M are P. So we're kind of familiar with this by now. All the things that are M, this red circle, are P. So everything that's M lies inside the P circle because it is P. Our second premise, some S are M. So all that we're saying is that in the overlap between this red circle and this green circle, that there's at least one thing that exists in this space, some S. That means, though, that some S are P as well, because by being an M thing, it's also going to be a P thing. It has to be. So some S are P. And then we're going to come on to the last one, which is a little bit different. So this one is called modus fereo. So again, let's look at the vowels in this to try and build up a bit of an intuition about what's going on. So we've got universal negation, E, from nego. And then we've got I, which is a particular affirmation. And then O, which is a particular negation. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense in the fereo. So what's our first premise? The E premise, no M is P. So we're saying, all the ones so far, if we look at these have all been universal affirmations. So we've had this class M that is P, and it's always been, actually, that's not true, sorry. Here it was different. But in this case and this case, we saw that M lies inside P. Whereas what we're saying now, similarly to in our second example, Celerant, is that everything that is M is not P. So they're, again, mutually exclusive sets. Nothing that is M is P. Nothing that is P is M. They're completely separate. However, then, let's combine it with our second premise to see what happens. So we say some S are M. So this second category, then, of things that are S, in the overlap between S and M, there's at least some member that exists, right? However, if it exists in this set of being M, it cannot be P. So whatever is in this S set that is something that is also M, right? Whatever that thing is that has M-ness cannot be P because of our first premise, no M is P. So we can conclude that some things which are S are not P. So now, what we're going to think about is these various combinations. How many combinations are there? Why is this notion of validity? So all of these arguments that we've gone through here, they've all been valid forms. And hopefully you've been able to build up a bit of an intuition for seeing why it is that the conclusion actually is guaranteed to be true by the premises. By looking at these Venn diagrams, and hopefully you're now able, if you came across a new one, to figure out whether that is or isn't the case. So let's talk about combinations. We have these four figures, or what will sometimes be called moods, which are different ways of arranging the major premise and the minor premise. So M here is our middle term. And then we have subject, predicate. Yeah, subject is S, predicate is P, and M is middle term. And these are all the different possible ways of arranging our premises. And that blank slot in the middle is going to be filled with A, E, I, or O. Universal affirmation, universal negation, particular affirmation, or particular negation, right? So I was thinking about this. How many possible combinations are there? You've also got to imagine that there is a row here for conclusions. So that's my major premise, minor premise, and there'd obviously be a conclusion of, S blank P. So how many possible combinations are there? Okay, so you've got to imagine that this, let's look at figure 1, this first square here, figure 1 major premise. That could be filled with A, E, I, or O. So 4 possible values. Okay, and then for each of those possible values, the minor premise could have A, E, I, or O. So that's going to be 4 by 4 or 4 squared possible combinations. So if we just thought about the number of combinations of premises, we'd have 4 squared times by 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. But because we have also a conclusion, we've got 4 cubed, which is going to give us the number of possible combinations of premises and a conclusion in each figure times by 4, which gives us 256 total combinations of arguments that can be made. If you were to allow the major and minor premises to be flipped, it'd be 512, but that's kind of vacuous because it's irrelevant for the logic, which is truth preserving. And then we have 24 of these forms which are valid, so that's 9.375%. So say if you were to just pick a form at random, that's the percentage of them that would be valid. I'm just thinking like I'm butchering my terms because I'm confusing percentages and probabilities and stuff. But that just gives you a picture for, so why is it important to study which forms are valid? And the reason is that, if we go with just any random combination, if we just start combining premises, it's not that likely that we're actually going to have a valid argument. So it's important to study the form to make sure that we're using the truth-preserving ones. So you remember, you saw some of these forms before when we were talking about developing that intuition for how it is that these things work. So we saw Barbara, we saw Celerant, we saw Darii, and we saw Furio. Now these were all in figure 1. So do you remember, figure 1 is in this form where we have middle term, something, premise, subject, something, middle term. Figure 2 are just arranged in a different way, same as figure 3 and 4. And these are the different names for the valid figures or valid moods. So you have enough tools, I think, now to actually figure out what each of these were, should you wish to. So let's just pick one at random. Phallapton, that sounds like a cool sort of word. So we know from it being figure 3 that the arrangement is middle term blank premise, middle term blank subject, right? And then, so the way that that's going to be arranged is middle term, universal negation, E, nego, P for predicate, and then it's going to be middle term blank S for subject, so middle term universal affirmation subject, and then our conclusion is going to be subject predicate with O, which is particular negation. So you have all the tools now to figure out what's going on if you sort of have the desire to get into weird Latin categorical logic and medieval stuff for some reason, or to use these names. I mean, I've not really seen them used anymore, but it's interesting nonetheless, I suppose. Also on Wikipedia, there's this really interesting table which looks at each of the forms, and it has these like Venn diagram representations of them, so you can see, you can help build that intuition of which are the valid forms, why are they valid, what are they really saying. So that's just a quick representation of that. And then there's also this article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which you can look at, which also contains the various forms, the mnemonic for remembering them, Barbara, Celerant, Darii, Furio, This little symbol here, the turnstile, just means entails, so entails the conclusion. Don't worry too much about that. And there's a really good article on this in the SEP if you're interested in reading more. Some of the sources that I've used to put together my slides here would be Peter Addison, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast, The Logical Works of Aristotle. So that is a really good podcast. It's about 30 minutes long if you're interested in listening to it. Aristotle's Logic, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article goes into it a bit more. The Name of Syllogisms by Alexander Douglas, who's a history of philosophy lecturer at University of St Andrews. That's where I learned about the affirmo and the nego. That's a really good blog, which is there if you're interested again. A book edited by Alex Malpass and, I forgot her name, Martha Marfori, The History of Philosophical and Formal Logic from Aristotle to Tarski, has a great chapter on Aristotle's logic. And I'm also going to be working from that throughout the rest of this series as well. And then the Wikipedia article on syllogism, weirdly enough, is just really good. It's full of these like representations of the Venn diagrams. A lot of these that I used earlier on were also from there. So you should certainly go and check that out as well if you're struggling to understand and trying to get your head around this stuff. If you have enjoyed this episode, then be sure to like the video, share it with people, and subscribe to the channel for more stuff coming up. And if you want to support my work and what I'm doing, then you can do so by becoming a monthly patron. The least heavy subscription fee is £3 a month to be a tier 1. And the more people who feel that they have that to give each month, it just helps me basically make these better, gives me a bit more time to do research and buy equipment and things to improve the quality of what I do. So I really appreciate that should you choose to go down that route. And if nothing else, I hope you've learnt something. I hope it's been useful for you, and thank you for watching.